60 episodes ago, I embarked on a dream to both share the stories of my peers and to shine a light on the systemic inequities that make feeding our babies way harder than it needs to be. We are mammals. We have evolved to feed babies milk from our own bodies. Yet, every day, women become mothers. People become parents. And they start off on that journey hopeful. And within weeks, a sense of inadequacy begins to crowd that feeling of hope and joy, when the very thing that makes us mammals, our ability to provide milk to our babies, proves to be so challenging. For this 60th episode, I am so pleased and only a little bit nervous to share the breastfeeding experiences of my great Aunt Jenna from over 60 years ago. She's really my husband's great Aunt Jenna, but I've adopted her as my own. As you listen, think about the last time you asked your family members about their birth and baby feeding experiences. If you've asked them, what systemic inequities did you learn about? What wisdom did you uncover? What were you surprised about? If you aren't able to ask, why not? Enjoy this incredible story from an incredible human. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
I am a 91-year-old grandmother of 2 children and 3 grandchildren, and a very large extended family, which includes Lo Nigrosh, who is a very darling relative of mine, whom I applaud very much for doing this. I live in California because, like many grandmothers, I followed my grandchildren. I went to live where my grandchildren were, and now they're all grown up and somewhere else. And I'm still waiting for a great grandchild.
Still waiting.
With every generation, you get smarter.
Right. Yeah.
When it's too late, Lo.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you are my great aunt-in-law, or great aunt-in-law, as Max said. Your Aunt Jenna. Yes. And when I started my podcast, I thought of you immediately to share your stories. And you were a little hesitant because you said, "Oh, that was so long ago, and I don't know if I have much to share." And then we talked about it some, and you did agree to come on. And the reason why I think it's important to share stories from so long ago is because we've come a long way in supporting people in birth and postpartum, but there's still a lot of systemic inequities. And I think it's important to paint the picture, the bigger picture of what it's been like over the years. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's important to hear the voices of women from your generation who paved the way for us to be able to work and have families, to do both. So I feel quite emotional that you're willing to share your stories with us, because it's not just about breastfeeding. It's about being able to have families and contribute to the world in a bigger way. And that has been a passion of yours for your whole life.
It has, and I can't really say that I can claim to have been a working mother when my kids were little kids, because I was, even though we were certainly not an affluent family. Uh, my husband was a social worker, and I do remember the first paycheck was $4,000 a year. So, you know,
Wow.
but I was lucky in that I did not have to um, work at that time. But what I want to say is that as when you asked me to do this, and I began to think back more than 60 years, it occurred to me that my memories, the top of my memories, the most important thing that I remember about, especially my first child, was the total lack of support.
Mm-hmm.
I was one of those people who thought I wanted natural childbirth, as we called it in those days. I guess you still
Mm-hmm.
do. And the medical community had not caught up with that. Uh, there were some books around, but I, for my first child, my daughter, um, we lived in a small town in Massachusetts, probably not unlike your current town.
Yeah, I
And
don't think I realized you were in Massachusetts.
yeah, Brockton.
Mm.
And um, the I asked around, and there was one doctor in town who said he offered natural childbirth. And when I went in to have my initial pregnancy appointment, it was clear to me that he had really no concept of what that meant. Okay, you don't want any anesthesia, that's fine. Period. End of discussion.
Right, right. And it's so much more than that. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, yes. Well, the other thing that was quite different then is that I spent, I think, 2 nights in the hospital, which is now, mothers don't do, and there was no reason for me to do. I had a perfectly healthy birth. But their notion of natural childbirth was that they wheeled my baby into my room and left her alone, and all the nurses disappeared. One less baby in the common nursery. Okay, she's yours. That's the way you
Mm-hmm.
want it. And of course, I got zero sleep for the first 48 hours
Right.
because babies cry and keep you awake and all that. I do remember a friend of mine who was a nurse in the other part of the hospital coming in about 2 a.m. once when I was coping with my little crying baby. And she said, "What? They just left you here all alone?" I mean, she was shocked.
With
And
nobody coming in, no support at
well,
all.
it didn't occur to me to question anything. And
Yeah.
what I think about what you're doing about after birth, postpartum support is just incredibly important because, the notion of doulas for pregnancy and birth is one thing, but really the hardest time, in my memory anyway, is those first couple months. And if you're a new mother and you have no experience and you're working everything out, um, support and information. I had friends in that town, although I hadn't lived there very long, and most of my friends were um, quite a lot older. And I think I was just too proud to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
So my whole memory is just of struggling. And I will say that the contrast, then we moved, and I had my second child, my son, in in Chicago, where again I asked around, and again I got a doctor who passed himself off as the natural childbirth person, but did zero to help. And but the difference was that I discovered a baby nurse. I didn't even know there was such a thing.
Mm.
She turned out to be the mother of a friend. So the second time around, I had this wonderful woman, very experienced, the perfect older, real mother, uh,
Mm-hmm.
who came and lived with us, moved in for 2 or 3 weeks, And that experience was like night and day.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
all of the lonely coping of the first time, and then suddenly I had this woman, and honestly, the difference is just so important. And I think what you're doing to try to provide that kind of information, if not the real baby nurse, but the kind of um, person you can call and talk to. But sleep is so important, and rest, and um, it's just,
Yeah.
was a totally different, much more pleasant experience.
That's amazing. Yeah, support makes all the difference.
Yep.
Uh, I want to hear more about each of those experiences in the postpartum time because we do hear time and time again when people are able to set themselves up to have support, which does not happen systemically. It's a matter of people finding the supports themselves, which is a
Yes.
systemic issue. So in the first experience, you had none. In the second experience, you made it happen. But before we do, can I back up a little bit and ask what was your exposure over 60 years ago to uh, breastfeeding and baby feeding before you were having your children or when you were pregnant? Did anybody ask you about breastfeeding? Did anybody talk to you about it? Did you have friends who had breastfed? Was it something that was discussed at all amongst your peer group or with your doctor?
I knew that I always wanted to breastfeed. I never questioned it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, where that came from, because it certainly wasn't in the air. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I lived for the first round. Um, my friendship circle was a fairly upscale, you might call them ex-urban moms, um, many of whom, as I dimly recall it, did not necessarily breastfeed. I don't remember any discussion of it anywhere. This was
Okay.
kind of all me, and of course, I talked it over with my husband, but um, and I tried to talk about it with the doctor, but the doctor certainly and his nursing staff certainly offered no. Do you plan to breastfeed? Do you
Mm-hmm.
need any help with it? And in the hospital for those first 2 days, I don't remember a single nurse coming in and saying, "How are you doing? Do you plan to breastfeed?" Uh,
Okay.
I just remember no conversation.
Tell us about that immediate time. When was the first time you got to hold the baby, touch the baby, cuddle the baby? Do you remember?
My vision includes a vision during labor and then in the room with later with the crib. But the moment that she was put in my arms, honestly, I don't remember.
With
It's
the
all,
second part?
I mean, generally speaking, though, I mean, it was very joyful. We were both
Great.
very excited to have this baby, and
Yes.
do remember being thrilled that she was healthy and beautiful, and this was very wish fulfilling.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, of
And,
course.
I do remember talking to her in the hospital while she was crying and saying, "Come on, give me a."
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so because you were choosing to breastfeed, you feel like that was the reason that she was not in the care nursery and that you were left to your own devices with no support.
Well, I got the feeling that I had a label on the door that said natural childbirth. And natural
Ah,
childbirth means put the baby with the mother.
uh-huh.
I think that was a part of their understanding of
Mhm.
natural childbirth.
Right. So then you go home after a couple of days and um had you established breastfeeding at all with either child in the hospital?
I certainly, I mean, whether my milk actually came in, during that 2-day period, I'm pretty sure it did. And we started, I don't remember any problem breastfeeding in the sense of pain or
Oh, great.
uh, difficulty attaching or,
Mm-hmm.
whatever I take to be standard problems. It it did turn out that she was um, a fairly unsatisfied baby,
Mm-hmm.
which at the time I attributed, and nobody told me different, to too little milk. I mean, in my memory is that she was always hungry.
Mm-hmm.
She would sleep a little bit after breastfeeding, but be awake in an hour, and I just felt for the whole first few months that I didn't have enough milk. That was my major feeling about it.
Mm.
That I had small breasts anyway. Is there any correlation between the size of your breasts and the amount of your milk?
No, not in standard breasts. There are, there are some, there are, like, if somebody, for instance, has undeveloped breasts, which can happen due
Mm-hmm.
to hormonal issues, um, which the breasts look very different. They're usually tubular. It's called insufficient glandular tissue. In
Mm-hmm.
that case, there can be insufficient milk supply, but typically the breasts are spaced really wide apart. They look more tubular. Um, there's typically some menstrual cycle problems that go along with it. So, in just typical small breasts, there's no correlation. Now, it can be that there is lower storage capacity, which means baby would feed more frequently
Mm-hmm.
than breasts that have a higher storage capacity. So if a baby takes in, 2 ounces in a setting, then they might get hungry 2 hours later and want to feed more frequently. But the breast can still make the right amount of milk for the baby as long as the baby is being fed frequently enough.
Well, my memory is that I really didn't know what to do about it, and I went back and
Yeah,
forth. I had Dr. Spock. Incidentally, Dr. Spock was the Bible in those days.
right.
Anybody
Uh-huh.
your age might not remember that.
I know of Dr. Spock. Yes. Yes.
And he had relatively little to tell me on this subject. Um, I didn't have a lot of books, and I certainly had no advisors. So I kind of went back and forth between feeding on demand, or then that didn't seem to work. So then I would
Mhm.
try letting her cry for an hour, which drove me
Mhm.
crazy.
Mhm. Yeah.
um, she, and honestly, I don't know whether I did have too little milk or whether maybe she had colic or, whatever they call
Yeah.
baby other problems, or she was a big, healthy baby. I think she was 9 pounds, both of them.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, 8.5 maybe.
Mhm.
But, um, and she certainly looked healthy. But when I finally, after a few weeks, I trundled off to the doctor, and who was palmed me off on a nurse who did not. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate this because I really have very little memory, but my memory is that the visit to the doctor's office consisted of, well, if she's not getting enough, I mean, not a question. I mean, I came in saying, is she getting enough milk from me?
Mm.
And they
Mhm.
said, well, if she isn't, why don't you add in formula?
Mm.
And so after, and I honestly, I don't know when, maybe it was 3 weeks, maybe it was 6 weeks, I tried formula, adding, substitute once a day, giving her a bottle. and she took the bottle fine, but then it turned out she was allergic to cow's milk, which
Mm.
was in the formula. So she didn't do well with that. So then they did figure that out. And so then we went to some kind of soy milk thing, um, which was okay. I mean, it didn't upset her. So we kind of went half and half for a while. But after about, and I don't even remember how many months it was, maximum 4 months, I think, maybe 3 months, I just gave up
Mm.
because she really just seemed to me to be hungry all the time. And
Yeah. And did she seem more satisfied once you started feeding the formula, or was she still
eventually she
just a
settled
hungry
down.
baby?
And,
Hmm.
she eventually settled down and it was fine after a while, but it was the whole thing. I mean, my memory of those months is my overall feeling of inadequacy. That's the memory I
Yes.
take away. It's my fault. I'm doing something wrong.
This experience happened over 60 years ago. And while there are some things about Jenna's story that show us that we have made progress in ensuring that more babies receive human milk from day one and that their parents feel supported to provide that milk, this is a story that repeats itself every day. Still, parents worry that they are not making enough milk for their baby. They make an appointment with the pediatrician. Instead of referring to the human milk specialists, lactation consultants, to find the root causes, they offer up formula as the solution. Sometimes this is the solution. After all, we need to feed the hungry babies. However, so many parents are left with a feeling of inadequacy, just like Jenna is describing, and that she remembers these 60 years later. Can we please interrupt this narrative? This is a systemic barrier that needs to change. If you are a parent who is already feeling that sense of inadequacy creeping in as you are feeding your baby, let me be the person who helps you tackle that. I would love to partner with you as your lactation consultant. You can find my info on my website at www.quabbinbirthservices.com.
I would like to know about your second experience where you had the baby nurse come. Did
Yeah.
she have experience with breastfeeding?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I remember I loved her, and because she was my mother's friend, I had already known her anyway. And
Okay.
I mean, the mother of my friend.
Okay.
um, and I saw her in family situations for a long time, so she was more like a family friend eventually. But during that period, I felt in a glow of happiness because
Oh,
she was very um, supportive and
yes.
full of good advice. She must have had plenty of experience with breastfeeding because she went from house to house. I mean, this was her profession.
Hmm.
Uh, but she was extremely helpful to me, and of course, I mean, they were only 16 months apart, so it would have been to be alone with a 16-month and a newborn would have been something else. So, I
So
mean, it
hard.
was
Yeah.
a blessing to have her.
Yes.
And, but I remember very little of the detail about the breastfeeding part, except that it went fine.
Hmm.
My son seemed happy with what he
Hmm.
was getting and seemed to sleep normally. And I got more sleep and
Hmm.
everything was easier. And, but to some extent, it's all in the mind.
Hmm.
She was there, and
Hmm.
all was well.
Yeah, but there's something to be said for knowing you're being supported
Yeah.
and feeling better. It
Yes.
can all be in the mind,
Uh-huh.
but that's important.
And it works.
Mental health
You
matters.
are better.
Yeah, right.
when
Yeah,
when you feel safe and supported, I'm sure that has a physiological effect.
absolutely.
Just as
Well,
when
there
you're
are
nervous and self-blaming, I'm sure that has a physiological effect as well.
so do you remember what sorts of supports she provided you in your home?
I have a mental picture of her, and just this lovely kindness. Um, I mean, she did chores. I know that. I mean,
Yeah.
she certainly put the diapers in the laundry
Mhm. Yeah.
and helpful things like that. Um, but in terms of exact, things she said to me or how she supported the breastfeeding and stuff, I'm sorry to say, Lo, I just don't remember any of that. I just
Yeah.
remember, well, I think it's also true in life that maybe you remember the stress things more vividly than the happy things. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
once the problems disappear, then there are no crisis memories or
Exactly.
all
Yeah. Yeah, and it could just be that your first was temperamentally a more difficult baby than your second.
well, I I think that babies do differ. Um,
Mhm.
we all know people will say, "Oh, that was such a happy baby. He was always a good sleeper," or things like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I'm sure they're better sleepers than others. At least it just
Mhm. Mhm.
at first. I mean, she grew out of it quickly. I don't remember her being a difficult sleeper later on at all. But
Yeah.
just at the beginning, it took her a while to settle down.
Yeah. 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 Um okay, so how long did you breastfeed your second?
Oh, I didn't breastfeed my son that long either. Um,
Mhm.
maybe 9 or 10 months, something like that.
Okay.
Maybe a
Yeah.
year, not more than a
Yeah.
year.
Okay.
But I
And
enjoyed
you
it.
would
I
yeah.
really, I have to say that in both cases, I loved the breastfeeding part.
Hmm. What did
The
you like about it?
the act of breastfeeding is
Mhm.
really a lovely experience.
Yeah.
Um, I especially somehow. I mean, I don't know. In the middle of the night when you're all alone, or actually in Chicago, we had a house, well, an apartment with a dawn facing window, and sitting in the rocking chair, nursing your baby and watching the dawn come up, um,
Mhm.
is a spiritual experience.
Everybody who has nursed a baby will agree with you.
Yeah.
We feel that deeply in our bones.
For in the first one, I don't remember anybody disparaging or discouraging breastfeeding at all, even in public. I mean, I probably, given the times, would not have uncovered in public. I would have found an alcove somewhere so I could not be uncovered in public. I mean, it was just not a time when you would do that. And now I see people doing it all the time, and it it's much more acceptable publicly, I think.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, I don't remember any negativity around it either time.
That's great.
Yeah.
I want to tell you all about a podcast I've been enjoying. It's called The Lindsay Elmore Show. This podcast is for people who believe they deserve to be healthy. The show has featured many New York Times bestselling authors and authorities in a variety of fields. Topics have included mental wellness, working with our genes, holistic dentistry, how to eat to starve cancer, parasites, chronic disease, and being your own badass advocate, to name a few. Dr. Elmore is a board-certified pharmacist on a mission to empower others to make educated choices about their own health. I just listened to the episode with my kids called Smart Animals, Stupid People, and we all enjoyed it together. I also enjoyed the episodes about embracing pain to resolve it and better living with minimalism. Because I know many of my listeners are all about making informed decisions about their own health, I know many of you will appreciate this podcast. Check it out.
I read a book recently. It's called Hunt, Parent, Gather. It was written by an NPR journalist who took her toddler to 4 different, a Mayan culture, Inuit culture, an Inuit tribe, I think 3 different places actually, and then is it called the Teklan tribe in West Africa. I might be pronouncing the name of the tribe wrong, but she spent time with each of these communities. And one of the things that she talked about was how childcare is just shared so much more amongst these communities. How old were your children when you moved to what country? It was West Africa? Nigeria. Okay. How old were you when you moved?
They were 2 and 3. Well, Lisa we went in August, and she turned 4 in September. And he was 16 months younger, 2 years old.
Wow.
And so they were little.
Okay. And you went as a Peace Corps volunteer?
Yes, as staff, because
as staff.
At the beginning of Peace Corps, you could not. This was the year that Peace Corps was founded. We were the second group overseas, and the rule was that if you had children, you could not be a volunteer, which was quite annoying.
Right.
But so we decided to go as staff. So I was a staff wife, and we actually had a house and some help. So, but yes, it was a culture. Well, not at first, really. I mean, we were in the capital for a few months, and then we moved up to the capital of the Western region in Ibadan, and that was where I had more of a chance to get to know local people. So they eventually went to school in a little local school there. So anyhow, yes, it is much more shared, although I will observe that even in Nigeria, the modernization of the middle class had some of the same effects that it does in America in terms of, not sharing your children, more isolated. Once you live in a big house, you don't get that business of passing kids from hand to hand.
Yes.
And it is much more in the village setting that you could observe the community participation in child rearing that you're talking about. And it applied actually not only to child rearing, but to elder care and to care of the mentally ill. That you could observe people with disabilities of various kinds um, just being tolerated in a community setting in ways
Yes.
we don't tolerate it here.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But the whether, I mean, I was trying to think when you were talking before about um, the lactation issues. I don't remember any actual sharing of breastfeeding or having nursing mothers take. I'm trying to remember if I had any experience of a mother having a wet nurse in
Mm.
Nigeria, and I can't remember at all whether one way or another.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Did you see breastfeeding more commonly there?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Openly? Hmm.
Oh sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and well, but it's the holding, it's the carrying.
Hmm.
What you see
Hmm.
all over Africa and Asia and everywhere else is that the baby is never in the cradle. The baby is
Hmm.
on the back or on the front or on the hip
Right.
with
Right.
a scarf wrapped around, some kind of textile wrapping to hold it on while
Right.
mom goes about her business.
No, that closeness of the baby is linked to um, higher levels of prolactin and oxytocin in the
Mm,
body, which means more milk.
sure.
Um, and so there is like a bigger push to have people in the US wear their babies when they can. Of course, when we have policies that, some people want to go back to work, as early as possible. And that's great when they want to do that. But when they're required to because their work policies don't pay them
Mhm.
to stay home, and they're forced to separate, and then they're not given the proper amount of time to pump when they're gone, um, then we see again a reduction in milk supply. And then people think my body has failed me. I'm not producing enough milk.
Yeah.
Um, so you saw people
How do
just
you
with
think?
their babies.
How do you think working remotely has changed that? Do you think more young mothers are able to carry their babies while they, I mean, carry in the sense of wrap them up and have them
Um,
close by? Or do you think it was just a problem that they couldn't work remotely because the baby was wanting attention all the time?
Yeah, I think it's a little no, I haven't looked at you know, I'm just speaking anecdotally here from what I've heard from people. I think it's a little mixed. I
Mm,
think often it depends on the temperament of the baby.
yeah,
Um, some people have been able to do it. Some of my clients have been able to successfully keep baby at home, but often babies need so much care. You really can't put a lot of attention on your work, do sustained work for many hours.
hmm,
The type of work that we do on computers, sitting down, you know,
yeah, yeah.
and care for the
Just
infant.
too easy for the baby to crawl all over the computer.
Right. Yeah. Crawl over the computer, not want to sit still for that long.
Sure.
So I know when Jolie was almost a year old, I took a job where I went into work and I would stand and wear her in a carrier on my back. And I had to answer the phones and do counseling over the phone, lactation counseling over the phone. And I would do 6-hour shifts, and there were a lot of toys in the environment I was in, and it was just me in the office, and I could do it. Um, it wasn't every day. It wasn't full-time work. It was a few days a week.
Hmm.
Um, and then I continued that for about 4 years, either at home or in the office.
Hmm.
Um, but I think it depends on how, again, how supportive the employer is of families.
Yes, exactly.
And in cultures like Nigeria, like in the village of Nigeria, did you see it in the cities too?
Um, Well, yeah, in the market, for example, any place where women were pausing, I mean, you didn't. I spent time, I guess, in a lot of schools because most of our volunteers were teachers, and then I had a job at the university eventually that involved going out to the villages. But I didn't spend a lot of time wandering the streets of my city, so I don't know, but I certainly don't think that the middle class and upper middle class families, women in Nigeria, spend a lot of time nursing their babies in public. I think they were more like our experience of being at home. And I mean, if you're at home, you're not by definition in public.
Right, exactly. Right.
And, I mean, there were plenty of working women in Nigeria, and in government and so on. I mean, it was not that women were all homebound. It's just, I mean, I don't have my vision of women nursing in public tends to be women either in the marketplace or in the village.
Okay.
Women were, pounding yam in public, but a middle class woman wouldn't pound her own yam.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Right. Which makes sense. I mean, you're not going to go out in public just to breastfeed, but
right.
If you feel comfortable, if you're out and you feel comfortable to be able to feed your baby whenever and wherever you need to,
Yeah.
It's important. It's important for future generations to be able to breastfeed their children.
Yeah.
I so appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. I know that you were hesitant. I think these stories are important, and I think my listeners will think your stories are important.
Well, yeah, I mean, in a way, a lot has changed, but I think, some things never change.
Some things never change.
Bless you for raising up these issues and giving them a good washing out.
Yeah, we have to keep beating the drum, as they say.
All right, we'll carry on.
I hope that my conversation with Jenna has inspired you to talk with a beloved family member about their baby feeding experiences. You may be gathered with them this week for the Thanksgiving holiday. Go ahead and ask. Once you do, join the Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook and tell me all about it. I want to know about the support your relatives did and did not receive. Do you have a relative or friend who would be interested in hearing this particular story? Please share it with them. And as always, please rate and review the Milk Making Minutes. In your review, tell me whose story you would like to hear. Is it someone big, like Beyonce? Or somebody more modest, like a good friend whose story you know needs to be heard? Let me know and I'll try to get in touch with them. Bye. Charlie, what would you say to someone who felt like they weren't a good enough parent because they weren't producing enough milk for their baby?
I would probably ask if they had any like healthcare providers that are trustworthy and aren't gonna just ditch them and say start pumping now. And if I knew anyone, I'd also recommend them.
Great, thanks.